Welcome to my review of Knights of the Round for the Super Nintendo. I did something a little different with this game when I did my playthrough. I did a two-player playthrough, and me and my friend, we refined the gameplay with practicing with save states to really learn the bosses, and we pretty much beat all the bosses, I believe, without any deaths, in practice anyway. And there's a tutorial that isolates all my best clips, my best attempts at the bosses and shit like that. So in that tutorial, it really details two-player strategies, and that's what I did a little differently. Normally my tutorials are single-player, but I did something differently since I didn't really... I played the game single-player initially, but then I kind of switched over to two players, and that's how I ended up beating the game. So it's a two-player tutorial is what it ended up being. So it's something a little different for the channel. So I will link that in the description if interested. But there, like with two players, there's some really nice tricks you can do and exploits, and really, you can really take advantage of the second player to pass the bosses around and beat the shit out of them. So there's some very cool strategies, and I'm going to show some of that in the review, but I'm not going to be going into detail about, how to execute everything. But yeah, this is a solid beat 'em up. It's quite good for the Super Nintendo. I wouldn't say it's one of the best ones, but it's one of the better ones on the Super Nintendo. I mean, it can be kind of repetitive and a little generic because these Knights of the Round, even for the arcade, was one of Capcom's more limited beat 'em ups where, there's not as many moves. You don't have running attacks except for the guy with the axe that I was playing as. He has kind of a dashing attack where it's forward, and strike, I believe, but he's the only one who has like a running type of attack. And he can't actually run. He can only do like a short dash, I believe, which is used for his dashing attack. But the controls really are much limited than a lot of other games had, If I remember right, there's not any throws or grappling or anything like that. So it's a pretty limited game. But as usual, Capcom makes good use out of the limited movesets to make, solid beat 'em ups. So it's still quite well designed, given the limitations of the movesets. There's not a huge variety of enemies, but it's a decent variety. So I think the game overall is pretty solid. It's not as stiff as some of Capcom's other beat 'em ups, especially the home ports of some of their games. Punisher for Genesis was a pretty bad port. A really bad port was Captain Commando for Super Nintendo. That was much worse than the arcade version. So you can really destroy these bosses with some two-player coordination, which can make for some interesting gameplay. You can't do that on single player like that. So it's very different on two players. The strategy is for two players. It's a very different tutorial than it would be as a single player. So it's really not applicable to that kind of, playing solo, but it is something a little different. Most people aren't going to be playing these old games on two players, but, if somebody's looking for a two-player game, an old game to play two players, they might find it useful. The game is a lot more enjoyable with two players, I'll say that much. Single player, it's a decent game, but it's a little dull, a little repetitive. Two players, I enjoyed it quite a bit, trying to coordinate the boss fights and, having one character take on another group of enemies, while you branch off, take off the other group, shit like that. It's a fun game to coordinate your strategies with. So I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was a lot better as a two-player game. But I'm only going to give it one review score. I probably could give it two review scores, two-player and solo, but I don't want to get too crazy with that shit, because then I could start giving review scores for, how the game held up when it came out compared to how it holds up now and shit like that, which I was thinking about doing for certain games. I have, kind of mentioned things like that in my reviews before, but trying not to get too fucking deep with it, because then you can kind of go crazy with reviews. But yeah, you can see how big coordination is on the two-player mode. You can really pull a lot of bullshit with the right coordination and take down bosses very quickly. It was still quite challenging even on two players. I mean, I think it may have taken over 5 hours of practicing and to beat it. It wasn't easy. Not super hard. It's a decent, challenging game, even on a single player. I got to the end on single player, I believe, but I didn't quite finish off the last boss. I think I might have got to the last boss on single player, but I didn't seal the deal. So now, had I beaten it on single player, I may have made a tutorial solo for the game, but I just didn't do it. I ended up fucking around. I like to jump around between games. I like to jump around between single player, multiplayer. Now, most of the time I play everything single player, but I was just kind of fucking around. I said, let's try 2 players and see what it's like. So this is the final boss. A lot of times I do show final bosses in my reviews. But yeah, like I said, getting more into the limitations of the game, moveset is limited, so it plays a little stiff compared to, better beat-em-ups. Like the Punisher for arcade is fucking awesome. Love that game. Double Dragon Advance, of course, that's not an arcade game, but that's one of my favorite beat-em-ups of all time. Mother Russia Bleeds, of course, we got modern beat-em-ups like Mother Russia Bleeds, Streets of Rage 4. Now, of course, those games are based off of the old retro style, but they've just improved on it so much. And, of course, even the fucking Streets of Rage games on the Genesis, even the third one, which gets a lot of shit, I think it's still a great game. It's not my favorite in the series, but it's still way better than most beat-em-ups that were released around this time. So, it's still a Streets of Rage game, and it has the best mobility of any of the Streets of Rage games as far as your movesets and your ability to move fast and accurately. So yeah, this game, it's a little limited. It gets repetitive. There's a lot of recycled enemies. The boss fights are pretty fun, but they're kind of repetitive on single player because the bosses are constantly going, off the edge of the screen and trying to hide, and you can only hit them at certain times, like a lot of beat 'em ups. And they have their invincible frames after you hit them. You have to get away from them. It's kind of typical, but I think it's a pretty good single-player game. And as a 2-player game, I would say it's a little bit better, And this was actually a second example of beating the final boss, where I think we were able to do massive damage combos by sandwiching the boss. So I showed this version of the final boss fight as well in the tutorial. I showed 2 versions of the final boss fight that we did. They were the 2 best executions that we had in practice and in the actual game. When we did our legit playthrough, we had a pretty good run of the final boss on that as well. But yeah, it's a lot more fun being able to pass the bosses around. I mean, it took hours of practice to get this guy down like this, but it's satisfying and it's a lot of fun on 2 players. So that really elevates the game. If you have someone else to play it with, and if you can, coordinate well with somebody, it can be a lot of fun. So that for me makes the game way better, But I'll be reviewing it more on how it holds up on its own, because a lot of games are more enjoyable with a second player, But for me, this game is a solid 7 out of 10. I think it's a solid beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo, and it's one of the better ones for sure. Especially with some of the shitty Capcom ports. This is actually a good Capcom port. Good solid 7 out of 10. It's a fun game. It has decent replay, but it's not the kind of game... It really doesn't stand up to the best beat-em-ups even of the time, you know what I mean? But it's a nice solid beat-em-up. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.